Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. We have a wonderful panel, as was just mentioned, but I want to say a few more words about the people we have up here today to talk about Trumpquake, another term from earthquake. My friend Fred Kemp, whom I'm sure all of you know as president of the Atlantic Council, wrote a piece that I read last night when I was flying here from Paris, and the headline was, "Everything is possible." There's so much we don't know about Donald Trump, about his advisors, about which way he will tilt and what the consequences and the echo effects of his administration will be. But we've got three of the best people in the entire world here to sort it out. Jon Huntsman, just to my left, is chairman of the Atlantic Council. He is former governor of Utah. He was a former deputy United States trade representative, so Donald Trump's comments on trade will be particularly interesting to hear from Jon. Jon was also ambassador to China and ambassador to Singapore, and if he had run and won his bid for the presidency, we wouldn't be in this mess right now. Jon was also running for the Republican ticket for President of the United States. So this is in part your fault, and I just want to make sure you know how I feel.
I feel so much better about life now.
Jim Jones, General Jim Jones, of course, is chairman of the Atlantic Council's Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. He was President Obama's first national security advisor. He has a long distinguished record in the military, but he was former commander of the U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander for Europe, where he led military operations for NATO. So I'm particularly interested in what Jim thinks will become of NATO now under Trump. And then we have Andrew Parasiliti, who is the director for the RAND Center for Global Risk and Security. Prior to that, he was editor of Al Monitor. He's had sort of a whole plethora of jobs in the national security field, but the one where I most loved and admired Andrew is he was one of my sources as a journalist in Senator Chuck Hagel's office. So I want to thank you for that. So let me just start out. I think that one thing I'll put on the table, my family's originally from Oklahoma. I was born in Kansas, and I have relatives and whatnot through Kansas and Texas and Oklahoma. These are very conservative parts of the country, and of my 100 or so second and third cousins, about 97 of them supported Donald Trump. I think there were 3 that went for Hillary Clinton, and maybe I got one more. I was an independent, but maybe one person shifted after the sexual tapes issue. But we talk about Trump to a certain degree as if he was a massive shock to the system. But if you're in these parts of the country, I want to make clear it was not a shock. It was an expectation that he would win. And I just want to put that on the table because a bias gets brought into this conversation that a lot of Americans were completely caught off guard. A lot of elites were caught off guard, but many regular Americans thought this was exactly the way it should be. And I just want to, as we get into the foreign policy conversation here, I want to ask you, Jon Huntsman, Governor Huntsman, to just share with us just your insights for a moment about the snapshot of what just unfolded in the United States and how you think it's playing in the country.
Well, we have, and Steve, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you as always. We have a self-correcting mechanism in American democracy called elections. And sometimes they deliver unexpected results and create violent shifts in the body politique. It's also a thing of some amazement as people from the rest of the world look at how this can happen in America, where the unexpected happens, where the predicted doesn't happen. So just anecdotally, every Ivy League graduate that I've talked to about the campaign over the last year guaranteed that Trump would not win. Every taxi driver that I've talked to the last year guaranteed that he would win. So, here's the lines of division within the United States between the coastal elites, rural and urban. It's almost as if the blue-collar Democrats are no longer Democrats. The Wall Street financial titans are no longer Republicans. It's like a fundamental transformation has occurred within the body politique. But you've got to dissect the numbers. And when you dissect the numbers, an important thing is happening in grassroots politics. So the big blue wall that people have talked about forever, Steve, over the last 5 or 6 election cycles, where Democrats have been guaranteed 242.
Go into a little detail on the blue wall for our thing, but not too much detail.
So the big blue wall being 18 states in America where Democrats have won a guaranteed 242 electoral college votes en route to 270, where the traditional and reliably red states will get you maybe 150. So the hurdle for any Republican running for president the last 5 election cycles has been almost insurmountable. And those are the big sort of Midwest industrial states. Well, if you look at that map, that big blue wall doesn't exist anymore. And I think one of the biggest casualties of the election was a transformation of industrial America. I mean, even yesterday, Michigan came in, which was neck and neck until yesterday after the recount. The electoral college votes went to Trump.
Yes.
Nobody guaranteed that would happen. So he gets 305 electoral college votes.
So let's freeze there for a moment. So you've kind of given a snapshot of how this is a major transition. When you look at those parts of the country, the people that have sorted Trump, the wrecking ball that he knocked down, the big blue wall, what do they think about international issues, international engagement? What is the foreign policy DNA of Trump supporters that you think he will carry forward?
Well, this is where foreign policy has been merged directly with grassroots politics, particularly in the American Midwest. And I would argue in much of grassroots America. And that is, A, we've been in the Middle East too long. 15 years of commitment in the Middle East, and it's worn sort of in ways that aren't positive on most American voters. Second would be immigration. That has become a driving issue this election cycle like I've never seen it before. And the third would be one of the pillars for which America has always stood tall in the foreign policy realm, and that's trade. So you say, was this a foreign policy election? A lot of folks say, well, no, it was all driven by domestic stuff. And I say, well, wait a minute, dissect it a little bit. It was about the Middle East. It was about trade. It was about immigration. These are all elements of our foreign policy. And the foreign policy elite in the United States, I think somehow, some way, need to better integrate their thinking about how these elements of foreign policy are impacting our domestic situation in the United States to come up with maybe a new way to understand how American politics is going to roll in the years to come.
General Jones, do you agree with John's assessment that this was about trade, immigration, and the Middle East?
Well, I do. I think that one of the mantras of the Trump administration was "Let's make America great again," and I think a subset of that is going to be "Make America great again in the Middle East," because frankly, and not just in the Obama administration, but even before that, we started going very wobbly, I think, in terms of our commitments. And if you look back now at the history of the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, and our Libyan incursions, NATO, the failure to enforce the red line in Syria, and so on and so on. We really do have to, if I were still advising a president, I would say, you really do have to recommit to this part of the world. And there's several ways to do that, but you really do have to make that commitment. And so I think that
any chance of you going to serve Donald Trump in that capacity?
No.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd love to be, I'd love to be helpful if asked, but I'm not going back in government. Thank you. Thank you for the thought, though. But I would say that security is a much broader concept than it was in 20 or 30 years ago. It does include trade. It does include energy security. It does include cyber security. It does include military strength, and it absolutely includes, I think, innovative ways in which the security elements of the region can come together with the United States participating to turn the tide a little bit and defeat extremism once and for all.
So I'm hearing something different from you than I just heard from John. John is saying that in part Donald Trump's success was fueled by a sense of fatigue about the Middle East, being overextended in the Middle East. And I think you're saying that Donald Trump is going to come in, and I've never heard anyone make this case before, re-engage with the region. And I have to say that I've never actually heard him articulate. In fact, I've heard him sort of articulate the opposite.
Well, he did strongly articulate the threat.
The ISIS element.
The threat of ISIS,
Yeah.
and the existential threat. And I think that, you know, one of the transitional things that you go through when you're a candidate and then you're a president-elect is all of a sudden you start really seeing the world as it really is, and you have to adjust to it. And from my standpoint, I'm not suggesting that I have any inside information here, but I mean, I think this is one of the most important, if not the most important part of the world that we need to engage in, at least from a security standpoint, to not only reverse the trend, but also prevent radicalism from extending into emerging countries in Africa and so on and so forth. I mean, it really is an important part of the world, and I think American commitment has to be restated, and it has to be demonstrated. It's not, the deeds have to match the words. So words are easy, but we will be judged by our actions.
Before I go to Andrew, let me ask you one other hypothetical question. Part of knowing a president is knowing their team, or you get to know them through their team. And I don't know that these individuals will be appointed or nominated, but there is money on John Bolton being Secretary of State. There's money on Senator Jeff Sessions from the South being Secretary of Defense, and money on General Mike Flynn being National Security Advisor. What is a Mike Flynn, John Bolton, Jeff Sessions advisory group, the three most important national security officials, tell you about a Donald Trump administration and foreign policy?
Well, I think that it tells you that the Defense Department will probably do very well in the new administration. I think the president-elect did campaign heavily on the fact that the Defense Department and the capabilities of American armed forces have suffered under the last 8 years. So I think I think you'll see that. And I do think that you'll see a very conservative administration, but that also focuses on the other elements of national security, which is trade, economic policy, and you know, the things that he said he was going to do. He's going to focus on immigration. He wants to defeat terrorism, cybersecurity, energy security, and do the work that's necessary to repair the reputation of the United States as a country that does what it says it's going to do. And that's, I think, I think that team would really stay on that message for quite a while.
Steve, I think part of the answer to the question is also what model of foreign policy management will Trump choose? Will it be a National Security Council-centric view of management, as we've seen recently, epitomized by the Henry Kissinger years, and even right up until recently, where the State Department is almost diminished or subordinate to a massively overbuilt NSC. I have some sense that he may go into the NSC and cut it down to size, which would be a good thing. That doesn't mean that he won't try to micromanage, because I think his natural instincts as a CEO are to be in full control. And that would mean that he wants his closest advisors on these issues right in the office next to him. But I think that choice in terms of how he uses the NSC will in large part determine how the national security apparatus plays out and how well synchronized and coordinated it then becomes.
Andrew, let me get your thoughts in here about the structure of both national security decisions but management. And I want to bring in one other wild card in this, and that's Russia, which has gotten so much play in the American media. Our former deputy director of CIA has gone so far to say publicly that he sees Donald Trump as an unwitting agent of Vladimir Putin. So this shows the ferocity of debate and concern on the national security issue side of things. So give us your insights on how you think he'll manage, but also Where does Russia come into it, or not?
Well, first, let me say thank you, Dr. Ebtisam, for inviting me back for the third Abu Dhabi strategic debate. It's wonderful to be here with such a distinguished group and such a great panel. First, it depends on who he appoints. I mean, we're seeing the process work out, and it's really tough to speculate on exactly how the foreign policy structure will work until we see who the players are. For example, if you get General Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor, as is speculated, General Flynn seems, I don't know him, but he seems to have had quite an influence on President-elect Trump's thinking. He could be a strong national security figure because he has been in the inner circle of the campaign. But again, this is an unknown, and it depends on various appointments you're talking about. The issue of Russia is a fascinating one. You know, on just a few days ago, Trump was asked this by the Wall Street Journal about Russia and Syria. And he said, I have an opposite view of what many people think regarding Syria. And in the context of that, was thinking about Russia. And let me try to put this in perspective of where we may be with Russia and be with Syria, given what was said in the campaign, like you said, where someone have accused him of being a witting agent or tool of Putin. The first point I would make is there may be a degree of support in the United States for working with Russia in Syria. And I know this is not the season for polls, given how many were wrong, but let me just cite one very recent poll. This is Shibli Telhami in the University of Maryland that says 67% of Americans would like to see more U.S.-Russia cooperation in Syria. Only 15% thought cooperation was less than they would like, and in fighting ISIS, 60% said put aside the differences with Russia on the Syrian regime and join forces. 35% of Americans prefer the elimination of Assad and ISIS, and when you break it out, only 2% support the removal of Assad. And that's the key difference between the US and Russia in Syria. Second, President Obama and Secretary Kerry also tried to work out an arrangement with Russia in Syria. So this is not necessarily so unique to Trump, because what they found was that in the absence of in the frustration of trying to bring the war to an end, there was a feeling that three interests could be served by engaging Russia. One is process on a political settlement, because the U.S. has no leverage with the Syrian government. Russia does. You need to engage the Syrian government. Two, humanitarian aid, which also depends on the Syrian government. And then third, also in coordination against ISIS and Nusra. This was something that Obama himself tried to work out. So that's not necessarily new. Third, alternative arrangements, which Trump has seen skeptical of in Syria in terms of a no-fly zone or the engagement of, or the increased training of rebel forces. Well, again, others here can comment on this, General Jones and others. We tried that too, and there were problems with vetting. And many of the Syrian groups that we've dealt with are embedded with Nusra forces. So this is indeed quite complicated. And let me just end on this session, Steve, by saying I think there's one thing that's another constant between the Obama administration and an incoming Trump administration. And that is a discontent with how the Iraq war played out.
Yes.
President Obama, the main foreign policy issue was the Iraq war was a mistake, and he wanted a responsible exit. That's what the American people believed. Trump, during his campaign, campaigned against and brought up again that he said he was opposed to the invasion of Iraq, although there's indications he may at some point have been supportive, but in any case, that was a plank of his campaign, and he reinforced that by making critical remarks about our intervention in Libya. That seems to have resonated. So when the U.S. considers, and then I come back to my point on Russia, deeper engagement in a conflict like Syria, there is a awareness among the American population that's been reflected in the current president and I think the campaign of the incoming president about deeper engagement in a conflict in the Middle East.
So let me ask all three of you this question, and you know, I think I've read every word Donald Trump has said on foreign policy. It's not a large volume, but I've gone after and looked at it, and I was with Donald Trump when he gave his speech at the Center for National Interest in Washington, D.C., and paid close attention to the detail of that. To me, and my Hillary Clinton supporting friends get furious with me when I say this, is that if you had a bar, on one end was deep engagement and intervention in the world, and the other was restraint, stick at home, focus more domestically, don't go looking for monsters to destroy. I would put Hillary Clinton at one end, more of the interventionist. For those of you who read the article in the Atlantic magazine called The Obama Doctrine, President Obama articulates very clearly and very compellingly his views on restraint. And to me, Donald Trump sounds a harder core version of Obama. Much more restraint, very little engagement. If you have a threat, go and nail the threat and then get back at home. No nation building, international institutions can't be trusted. So I'm interested in whether the debate here has really been between Obama and Hillary all along, and not as much between Trump. That Trump and Obama carry more of the DNA of being cautious of the international order today, and Hillary Clinton represented a kind of that burden of America continuing to play the global guarantor of security. And I'd love to get your reactions. John?
I think Trump has a natural skepticism about global engagement. And it may be just an outgrowth of his own personal experiences as a business person. But I think his worldview, you know, I don't know that he sees the world in broad strategic strokes or concepts. I think it's very much pragmatic and tied to national interests that speak to economic success and security. I think those are the two pillars.
So he's a
through which-
mercantilist.
So, well, perhaps. I think you could probably use shades of that term in describing him. But, you know, what will be the national interests through which the prism through which he views U.S. interests? And I do believe they're going to be heavy on economics and heavy on security. So that will take us a little bit away from the prism that has been the traditional sort of sense of U.S. interests, which has been global security and values,
Right.
and trade. And I suspect we're going to have a lighter footprint in all three of those areas. The bigger question then becomes, with a lighter footprint in global security, values promotion, and trade, is there a vacuum or a void that is created? Who fills it, and what are the implications longer term for
So
the
let's
world?
hold that, because I specifically want to know what the implications are for this part of the world. Jim?
You can't have it both ways. In my view, virtual presence is actual absence, and you're either a global power and you have to do the things that global powers do. Otherwise, you create vacuums that are going to be filled by people that don't have your best interests at heart. The evidence of that is all over the place. So I don't know. We'll know in his inaugural address what his strategic vision is, because you have to make that case. But I think that we've moved into a different era where global leadership or participation by the United States is really fundamentally a simple formula. You have to have security if you're going to be able to do anything. Mm-hmm. But the era of just pure military intervention and then withdrawal is an abject failure in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Libya in particular. Number two is, if you're going to intervene and reestablish a security environment, you have to have a follow-on economic plan that gives the people of the region that you're trying to shape hope for the future. Mm-hmm. And that economic plan has to convince the mothers and fathers of young children that the future is going to be better under this system than under the other system.
So you're making a case, these are the things that Trump has to think about and has to hear.
Yes, I mean, I think it's reality, frankly, and And if they're not there now, I think they'll have to be there. And if Mike Flynn is the National Security Advisor, the third element of engagement has to be governance and rule of law. And those three things, that's the three-legged stool that has to be balanced. So the days of just military intervention to solve a problem, as we did in Iraq, to a certain extent in Afghanistan, and certainly in Libya, are over. And so I think that over the course of the next several months, I would hope that the doctrine that the strategic doctrine that they have to articulate has those elements within it. And by the way, this is not just a public policy, this is a public and private sector policy. The private sector in countries like the UAE and in countries like the United States really have to be part of the equation in the future if you're going to achieve peace and prosperity in the long term. So I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can, and I had this argument with Donald Trump when I was in uniform, because he wanted to bring American forces out of Europe and bring them back to the US and then ship them out whenever there was a problem and then pull back again. That is...
You mean Barack Obama or Donald Trump?
Donald Trump.
Oh, you were arguing with Donald Trump?
I mean, not Donald Trump, I mean Donald Rumsfeld.
I said you're ready to go work for him.
Rumsfeld,
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Secretary of Defense. but that we started talking about those things way back then, about the value of forward presence. And I would argue that the value of American forward presence is probably more important today than it was 20 years ago, but it has to be different. It has to be a whole of government, whole of society, and it has to factor in things like cybersecurity, energy security, things like that.
So I still want you to answer my question, because you've spent more time with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton than anyone in this room. How would you rank the three, Donald Trump, Obama, and Clinton, when it came to degrees of intervention, from those who'd be most interventionist or globally engaged and those would be least?
I would agree with your characterization right now that Hillary Clinton was probably more on the intervention scale. I think President Obama has evolved quite a bit from the first 2 years in the White House when I was there to how he ended up. And I think I would put Donald Trump I would put him more in an evolutionary sliding scale right now, because we don't know.
That's back to Fred Kemp.
Because there is a lot of gray
Everything is
area in
possible.
between. There is a lot of gray area in between.
Andrew, same question.
Well, I think that General Jones really gave a textbook answer on the demands of global leadership. And if you don't go out with a clear agenda of global leadership, there will be vacuums and it will come back to us in one way or another. When I think about some of the things that Trump has said during the campaign, one thing he's brought up is he's, on one level, challenged the foundation of our alliance structure, saying our allies in the region need to pay more of their fair share of the costs. He said this about the Middle East, he said it about Asia, and he said it about NATO. And I think as the administration comes, the new administration comes in, if I had to put it in a clinical sense, I would say that there will be an assessment of burden sharing and the costs of burden sharing. And which is really quite fascinating. I'd be interested in hearing General Jones on this, because on the one hand, when you introduce a challenge to your allies, that's picked up by your adversaries. So if you say our NATO allies have to do their fair share, or our allies in Asia, or our allies in the Middle East, well, that's being picked up in China, Russia, Iran, and elsewhere. On the other hand, the US governments, including the Obama administration and prior, have called for our NATO allies to pay more of their fair share. The requirement is that NATO allies are to pay 2% of their GDP towards defense. They pay, I think, 1.18. We pay over 3%. So there is a bit of an imbalance. And if you look at when Secretary Carter or President Obama, probably speeches you've given at NATO in the past, has been to call on our allies to do more. The way President-elect Trump has put this during the campaign has probably been a bit impolitic. But what I take away from this, as I look at the campaign and his coming in, is there will be a kind of weighing of the burden sharing, maybe the demands of global leadership, point to the alliances hanging together. But in the short term, I think there'll be a bit of a give and take there that we haven't seen.
If I could
Jim?
I completely agree with what Andrew has said. And in my previous statement, what I was saying was articulating an American position, but I should have gone a little bit further and say that, but this will be different than during the 20th century where, the American position was, okay, we'll do all the heavy lifting, and you don't have to do much, to the allies. Those days, I think, and Governor Huntsman would know better than I on politically, but I think in the American mindset now, in Main Street USA, you will find a willingness to participate, but we're not going to want for other people the freedoms that they don't want to pay for them. They don't want to participate in themselves. In other words, it's going to be more of a American participation, but with regional actors also participating economically.
Isn't that another form
politically.
of leading from behind?
Yeah, I think that policy is obsolete.
Here to stay?
It's gone.
Oh, it's gone.
No, it's not leading from behind. You can lead from the front, but you're not going to be alone, and you're not going to be alone in fighting and dying. You're not be alone in paying for it. You're not going to be alone in the political commitment it takes, and you have to be together on this. So,
But that sounds to me like Barack Obama. Every one of the things you just said were his requirements for taking action in other countries. He would add an international vote or international legitimacy, working with others to take action, making sure that that force would have some preponderant effect. But all of the things you just mentioned, particularly in clustering a coalition of the willing, sounds like Obama. So I'm trying to distinguish the difference here between how Donald Trump is going to engage the world and how the current president right now is doing so.
Well, let's just imagine that the bumper sticker phrase is where his head is. Make America great again.
Right.
My sense is, and again, we're reading tea leaves here, and without question, Trump will be tried on the international stage the first 100 days by a couple of players in the world, and we'll further see transformation. But my guess is he would argue that we can't be effective abroad unless we're effective at home. And that if you have an imbalance with respect to America's commitments, let's just say to NATO, where if we're paying 60% of the bills and you don't have anyone but Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia paying 2%, then there's an imbalance, and that has to be addressed. And I think most of the American people would say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you can apply that to any corner of the world. But I think the bigger picture is, unless we can get America's growth engines fired up again, then we don't have an effective foreign policy. We can speak the words, but nobody is going to respect us. That's why it's going to be important to really focus on the events of the first 100 days, because I think there will be a very ambitious legislative agenda now that you've got Republicans in control in Congress for the first time since the 1920s. So might this result in hubris, where you overdo it, as was done 8 years ago with health care reform? It's hard to know. But I think we can probably infer that in the first 100 days, we're going to see the following. We'll see Congress sworn in. We'll see the committees constituted. We'll see a budget Can you imagine this, a budget, Steve? How long has it been since we actually talked about getting a budget done? Probably in March. And then probably 5 or 6 significant pieces of legislation that will go right to the heart and soul of rebuilding the American brand. Tax reform, infrastructure.
So you sound very optimistic.
Well, this is new. And we in America, particularly in the western part of America, which is flyover country, we tend to be eternal optimists.
I see.
We tend to see the broad expanse of possibilities in the new frontier of America. So I would extrapolate my own thinking as a Western American into, okay, if we get tax reform, if we get infrastructure, $1 billion, $1.5 billion package, public-private partnership, if we're able to get health care reform. So it's going to be a very important discussion if you amend Obamacare, let's just say it's now amending Obamacare,
Right.
keeping pre-existing conditions along with your son or daughter on your insurance policy if they're in their 20s, which are big cost items, by the way, probably $500 billion in costs right there. This could be a very important bipartisan moment. So as someone who's a bipartisan person, I've been looking for bipartisan moments.
Right.
We haven't had any. I mean, Obamacare, healthcare reform was a straight up Democratic vote, not one vote from the opposition party. And as a former governor, I can tell you, if ever you get to legislation that carries only one party, it's doomed for failure. So I see maybe 3 buckets that could emerge as bipartisan opportunities. Taxes, infrastructure, healthcare reform. With immigration, it's not likely to be too bipartisan because I think the thrust is going to be border security first and then pathway to citizenship maybe 10th. And that's going to cause a lot of rancor within the body. And then the Supreme Court nomination is likely to be highly partisan. And then you'll have sort of a daycare bill that will probably be number 6. It'll be very bipartisan. So we have in the first 100 days an opportunity, or maybe through summer, let's say, to get some bipartisan things done. And I'll tell you why that's important. Because I think the muscle mass of our legislative body is so out of shape when it comes from bipartisan efforts. We haven't seen any. That muscle mass has to be rebuilt. We need to condition the body politic in the earliest possible stages to get something done from a bipartisan standpoint so that we actually learn that rhythm.
I feel like it's important to raise a sort of counter vision of this, which I think much of the world is seeing, but also a lot of America's feeling. If you were to go into Los Angeles and look at Wilshire Boulevard and 100,000 people shutting down the city of Los Angeles, or the LGBT community that's worried about what can happen on the courts or losing safety, or African Americans who have felt like the police have had sort of a license to kill them in some wanton way, that we've had a lot of racial, ethnic, identity, and class tension in the United States. And what people see as having emerged, which was similar to what happened with Brexit, is a kind of dark nationalism that has risen. A kind, people call it a nativism, a new form of non-inclusive nationalism. And when you begin looking at, I read Fred Kemp a lot, when you begin looking at Europe and the elections that are going to be coming up in the Netherlands, in Germany, and what's been happening with Farage meeting Donald Trump right away, with France and Marie Le Pen, that you begin looking at what the world and its leadership might look like, particularly in the transatlantic relationship, which is so key to certain of the trends that we've been dealing with in the Middle East. Doesn't that give you pause? I mean, I just want to, aren't you guys worried about an alternative future that looks a lot nastier than you're painting?
So I think we have to look at the root causes. So what got us to where we are, both in America and in Europe? I think the root causes are economic failure for the most part. Economies have faltered. You've got huge demographics of working age people who have completely been detached from the workplace.
Right.
As a result of the storms that blew through in 2008, 2009, and beyond, and they haven't been reconnected.
Right.
And you have a huge level of despair, which has led to broken families, which has led to a high incidence of drug abuse, quite frankly. The opioid problem in America is at an all-time high. I say this doesn't just happen by itself. It happens in a void in which you have no opportunity and no jobs. So there are cures. You have to identify the root causes. I think Europe is the same way. And then come up with public policies to address them. So if you have a Congress that's willing to say, let's hit the gas pedal and grow,
Right.
recognizing we've got a lot of collateral damage, and
Right.
you mentioned a lot of the collateral damage that has resulted. I found as governor, when you've got jobs for people, that's opportunity. Opportunities settle folks down. It gives them an ability to pursue their talents and their aspirations. Without it, you've got real trouble.
Jim?
Well, I think that you know, there is a certain fragmentation in our society right now, and I think it's the job of the chief executive and the president to provide the leadership to say, this is what's important for us as a nation. We're all Americans. These are our values. These are our goals. We're not perfect, but we're going to work on these things. And one of the things I've seen over the last 30 or 40 years of public service is that there are very few people at the senior leadership level in our government right now that have had any kind of national service. Now, we used to have a conscripted force. You know, we did away with the draft. We replaced it with all volunteer force. I'm in favor of figuring out a way in which young people become vested into who we are as a country and what our identity is through national service of some sort. And I think it can be built. And I don't mean military service. I mean military service would be an option. But I think there is an obligation to inculcate in our young people what it means to be an American. And you do that through actual service. I mean, of some sort, political, civic, whatever you want it to be.
But Jim, if I were listening to all of this and I were a citizen of the UAE or Saudi Arabia from this region, I'd say, geez, these guys are really screwed up, very self-absorbed. You know, the jobs, there's just no way they're going to be there for us when we need them. That the bet that this region would make logically is that with everything going through, and particularly with the statements that Trump has made about America first and whatnot, when the Saudis or UAE or GCC has a tough time in the future, you can't count on the United States as much as you used to, so they need to make different bets. And what bets do you think they should make?
Words are important, and when you have a declaratory policy that the United States is pivoting towards Asia, if you're sitting here in the Middle East, you're drawing conclusions with a statement like that. And I think that was a mistake. I mean, I think that was, regardless of whether it was inevitable that we do shift economically, but to say, for the United States to say we're pivoting towards Asia means you're pivoting away from something else. And in the Middle East, I think that was the way it was interpreted. And we have not reversed that. So from my standpoint, it needs to be reversed. It really gets back to the fundamental question of the leadership of this country deciding what America wants to be and how it wants to participate. And you can't have it both ways. I mean, you're either all in or all out. Now, different ways you can rearrange things and relationships. And last year we sat here and I posited that a GCC type of emulation of NATO might be good for defeating existential threats.
A GCC NATO.
Sorry?
A GCC NATO?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of problems with that, but I mean, conceptually, if you're facing an existential threat, you want to do the things that will enhance your survival. And I said last year here, I said that I believe that just like in NATO was formed by countries that historically didn't get along. The British, the French, the Germans, and they came together against an existential threat called the Soviet Union. So, and the United States has had a much easier time of dealing with NATO as an entity than 28 different countries separately. So,
right.
And it's something we're thinking about, and I was happy to hear comments yesterday on this stage from people who were echoing those
I want to go to the audience soon, and so get your questions ready, but I want to do a quick lightning round. Andrew and all of you. But Andrew, does he rip up the Iran deal? Does he renegotiate the Iran deal? And does that create a global crisis? Real fast form.
Yeah, very quick, but let me just say 4 very quick points on that. The first thing about the Iran deal to understand is that there was no popular consensus in the United States on the Iran deal. Okay, when this was passed, it was not a treaty. It did not go through the Congress in normal procedure. We could go into what the legislative piece was, but basically, the deal was...
It's international arrangement.
Right,
Yeah.
but the deal was widely unpopular, and that matters when foreign policy doesn't have a domestic consensus. 2, even if you had Secretary Clinton elected, we already see within the Congress legislation to put more sanctions and put more pressure on Iran. There's already legislation about trying to block the Boeing deal, tougher sanctions on their ballistic missile program and those who aid and support it. That's the feeling in the United States. How does this work internationally? Now, this is an international agreement. So the EU is committed. The EU Foreign Policy Chief Mogherini just said this week, that's our responsibility. Very quickly, how do you do it? The only way the deal is abrogated formally is if Iran is in breach by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Otherwise, how do you walk it back when the EU wants an office in Iran? Russia and China, India are already there. And the countries are doing business there.
Okay.
Sorry.
So Israel-Palestine, Jim.
So I think there was another opportunity lost. I think
just underscore that another opportunity lost.
Yes.
In the Trump administration.
No. In the
Obama administration. This is looking forward. What happens looking forward?
Well, I think very quickly, and this is a very complicated subject, and many
I know you
here,
want an hour, but you got 1 minute.
No. But I will say this: the nub of the Israeli-Palestinian problem is that we have one leader who's willing but not capable, and the other one who's capable but not willing. And I believe that the United States, in cooperation with our friends in this part of the world, in Europe, should have and should continue to, if they can't have these two leaders come together and solve it, and the history suggests that they can't, and I would go a step further and say that they won't, then I think the United States has to rise above this very, very important problem and submit a plan that makes a lot of sense and would be supported by not only the region but also elsewhere in Europe. And we convince the two main actors.
Even though senior Israeli leaders right now say the ascension of Trump kills the Palestinian state, and they're now issuing new licenses for new settlements very rapidly under the assumption that Trump won't challenge them.
I don't know where the Trump administration will come down on this, but I think it's still one of the most important foreign policy issues that face us, and the United States has to provide the leadership to do whatever is required.
And John, before I go to the audience, help us see what's going to happen with Syria, Iraq, and if you want to throw in Turkey and do it in about a minute, that'd be great.
You know, this reminds me a lot of the presidential debate stage where you're given a complicated question and 30
See, John
seconds to
hosts a
answer.
radio show, and I know he does this to people on his show like me. So give us a minute, John.
Well, let me just say that the short answer, whether it's to the Iran deal or Israel-Palestine or healthcare reform, Obamacare, I think that words to remember are, we go from repeal as a word that is often used in a campaign context to amend. So I think amend will be the operative term going forward when one begins to see the real world. But he'll have to learn a lot about the costs in Syria, the costs of not dealing with the ISIS threat, dealing with Assad. Does he stay? Does he go? But beyond that, what happens to 42,000 hardened foreign fighters who are going to be disrupted in places like Mosul and Raqqa and the fall of Aleppo? They're not going to disappear, and 7,500 of them are from the West. And so what happens from a security standpoint if that doesn't happen the right way? And then the flow of refugees. Let's not forget the people, the innocent men, women, and children who are caught up in this maelstrom that will affect Turkey and to some extent Europe. So immersing yourself in this whole issue and then coming to grips with Russia in or out. And it seems to me that he's going toward Russia in terms of wanting to collaborate more on how Syria works through all of these issues so as to preempt any kind of war between the two of us. My guess is that there's more of a not repeal but amend kind of attitude, even on issues like Syria.
Fascinating. I'd love to go into Turkey and things, but many of you have the same questions I might have, so why don't we include the audience and begin with all of you. Let me ask Saad Al Ajmi. You're microphone should be on.
Thank you.
And
Thank you,
wave
Mr.
so I
Chairman.
can see you.
Right here.
Okay, great. Hey, nice to see you.
Okay. I should be on the camera soon. There you go. All right. I'm Saad Al Ajmi from Kuwait University, and I have a couple of comments that are in the form of question or so. I think, first of all, that we should just deal with realpolitik. I mean, Trump is going to be a president, and in my view, this is the penultimate stage before something major happens in the United States. Come 2020, I think we're going to have to be talking about a completely different candidate and perhaps another Bernie Sanders kind of president, because a lot of the reasons behind the election of President-elect Trump is the protest vote, which was very mad at the conspiracy within the Democratic Party against Bernie Sanders. One. Two, we're not the only one. The only condolences that we have is that we are not the only ones who are worried in this world about how mercurial or how uncanny the foreign policy of the United States under the Trump administration is going to be. The Canadians share this worry with us, so do the Mexicans and NATO, Europeans and Korea,
Everyone.
you name it. And three, we should also actually use this as another wake-up call for us, that look, the world is changing, America is going to think of America first, and perhaps we started our awakening in the form of saving Bahrain from falling into the hands of political Shiism,
Right.
which the Americans were taken aback, they didn't know about. Even the MI6, who are quite active in the region, they're active everywhere actually in the world, but particularly in the region, were taken aback by the fact that we saved Bahrain from falling into political Shiism. And Operation Resolve Storm was also a surprise to the Iranians,
Right.
at least, to say the least. And then finally, we should actually not dwell much about what he is going to do to this region as much as we should say, okay, what are we going to do regardless of what the Trump administration is going to do?
Right.
And I hope that our American friends can actually have a take on that.
I think that's a very wise and interesting frame, and it comes back to the point that I was saying, is that if there is this view that we're mattering less than we did, if the American footprint is going to be distracted or engaged or whatnot, perhaps this equilibrium in the region is going to be defined by other things. And so I guess, gentlemen, if you could answer that, people like Charlie Kupchan have written about the end of the American era. Ian Bremmer has talked about moving to a G0 world where there is no completely dominant guarantor. Is that ultimately a potentially healthier situation? I think that's the implication of Saad here. General?
Well, I think it is reality in the sense that this century has a multipolar century. It's not bipolar anymore. And we have to recognize that. But having said that, the United States has an obligation to be a good partner and to do what we can for the cause and advancement of freedom. And we have this messy world now with all kinds of non-state actors that threaten to disrupt our way of life. And one of the things I would go back on Iran and say that we didn't do enough is we didn't take the deal out to its logical conclusion that Iran has to modify its behavior, not just in its nuclear ambition,
Right.
but also in its export of terrorism and fundamental upheaval in the region. We've got to change that behavior. So it is a multipolar world, and we have to find the arrangements that the concessions that we need to make and the adjustment we need to make in order to be effective.
Thank you. Great. Another question. We have Alexander Shumilin.
Yeah. Thank you. All the panelists were excellent, but my question goes to Mr. Andrew, who spoke a lot about the Middle East and provided us with some polls figures, very spectacular, showing that a great part of the American population is tending to see the growing cooperation with Russia on the Middle East. Such a stance is already greatly welcomed in Russia. It's quite understandable. But it puts Mr. Trump before a choice Mr. President Obama faced recently, 3-4 years ago, the choice to be closer to Russia, either to be closer to Russia or to be closer to the American Gulf partners. Mr. Obama preferred the first to be closer to Russia, and he ended up very upset, as we know. My question is whether you or, I don't know, the future, the upcoming team of Mr. Trump do realize or do perceive as realistic the possibility to implement the scenario defeat ISIS first, which underlines the possibility to join the two forces, the two opposing forces, I mean the Syrian army, official army, and the Syrian Free Army. Is it realistic? Could it be perceived as such as doable? This is my question. Thank you.
So I'm just going to briefly repeat the key element is to Andrew. Is it realistic to look at a deepening of coordination and relations and partnership between Russia and the U.S., the Syrian army, the Free Syrian Army? To bring them in?
Mr. Obama preferred to be closer to Russia, sacrificing his relationship with Gulf Arabs. If Mr. Trump goes the same way, whether his team or Mr. Andrew in person also perceive as realistic the possibility to join forces, the Syrian official army and the Syrian Free Army to defeat ISIS first, to implement this scenario. Thank you.
I think joint probably a bit of a stretch. When the Obama administration tried to negotiate the deal with Russia, it was along very specific parameters. It was to allow humanitarian access. It was to be a catalyst to get a political process moving again under UN auspices. And it was about setting up a coordination mechanism for joint military and intelligence sharing activities against Nusra and ISIS. The reason it didn't work is because the United States and Russia have a difficult relationship. This isn't something we're working out with a close NATO ally. So other issues intervened. Also, what might have intervened is the degree of Russian influence with the Assad regime. May have been more difficult than we and the Russians themselves may have anticipated to bring Assad along. That all being said, there is a logic in engagement between the US and Russia in Syria for those three reasons: political settlement, humanitarian issues, and the shared interest in defeat of those terrorist groups. It does not mean that the US and Russian interests are aligned perfectly. They rarely are in the world, and it does not mean that there are not other issues in the US-Russian relationship which intruded when the Obama administration was trying to make this deal, and could indeed intrude again as the Trump administration looks through how it might engage with Russia and Syria. But that all being said, it seems from everything Trump is telling us that yes, he will be looking for ways to engage Russia. My initial thought is that it would be, at least initially, along the same lines as what Obama tried.
The one thing I'd like to add editorially to that in my moderator role is that there are certain people in the Obama administration, like John Kerry, who've been great advocates of trying to find a pathway with Russia, of working with Russia, and we're on the verge of a deal with Russia to establish a joint implementation center that would coordinate targeting and try and separate Nusra from other groups. And then we managed to accidentally kill 67 Syrian soldiers, after which the Russians began to accidentally kill lots of humanitarian convoys. So I think that there is that element in the Obama administration that could create an interesting kind of continuity into the Trump administration. One thing we haven't talked very much about is what would be continuous from Obama and what wouldn't. You could call this the Kerry initiative a continuous element if it went that direction. Let me take another question. Abdul Khalek Abdullah.
Right in here.
Hello. Greetings. How are you? And
Doing
please,
fine.
please ask
Thanks.
Jon Huntsman something.
Or not.
This is Abdul Khalek Abdullah, Professor of Political Science from the United Arab Emirates here. Thank you, gentlemen, for trying to make some sense about the Trump victory here. But frankly speaking, as a citizen of this region, citizen of the world, I am not one bit reassured that there is an angry white American in the White House for the next 4 years to come. I think this is utterly shocking, and in a way, it comes at a time when the confused world, when the chaotic world, when the world is full of confusion, is ending up with America sending us messages. We expected direction, we expected leadership, we expected certainty from America, not a huge dose of uncertainty and confusion in this chaotic global politics. We heard from fellow Republican, from conservative media outlet, how Trump is reckless, dangerous, nightmare, unfit, uniquely unqualified, etc., etc. So these things are still resonating, and it will take some time to settle down. My question to you here in Abu Dhabi and in Gulf capitals are looking for an advice from you, gentlemen. Just one line of advice, maybe less than half a minute, not 1 minute, Mr. Chairman. One line of practical, reasonable advice how to deal with this white, angry American in the White House for the next 4 years to come. Thank you.
Wonderful question. Governor?
How to deal with this white, angry American in the White House? Well, you just described a lot of Americans, maybe not in White Houses, but people are feeling a level of angst and anxiety for a lot of very legitimate reasons, I have to tell you. And it's, first of all, how you settle down and address the cause of that anger and that angst. And we'll see in the years ahead if we've got a recipe that works. But it's unfair to judge an incoming president based on campaign rhetoric. And I take you back to when I worked for a guy named Ronald Reagan, who was elected in 1980, having said in the case of China that we would take our ambassador out of Beijing and send him back to Taiwan, which were probably the most dangerous words spoken in that relationship in that year, causing great anxiety and concern in terms of that evolving relationship, only to see him, and I know because I was on this trip with him, a couple of years later making an historic trip to China and signing non-proliferation agreements, signing most favored nation agreements, and speaking to 1 billion people who had not heard the voice of the President of the United States on their land in a very long time. So I think we give some time to the incoming president. But mostly, I think you need to look at the 4,000 positions. 1,000 of them require Senate approval, which is a very high level in our government. Financial disclosure forms, FBI background clearance, and the Senate ultimately voting for you, because that, in a sense, will be policy. And the people he brings around him, I think, will be absolutely key. But for us, I think we all need to identify what are our shared and common values in our bilateral and multilateral relationships. How can we naturally connect one with another to improve the plight of people to improve economies, and to create a better backdrop for security. Those will be the enduring questions that any administration would have, even Donald Trump's administration, I'm guessing. But let's be patient and let the next couple of months play out and see where the priorities begin to evolve.
Jim?
He may surprise.
I agree with that. I think the stage is set. I mean, we may not like how we got to where we are. We may not like the rhetoric. But the stage is set for a new president. He has a Republican Senate, a Republican House. Majority of governors in the country will be Republican.
34.
And I think there's great opportunity here. And I think rather than think about the rhetoric and the campaign, the words that were used in the campaign, I think now we're starting from a clean sheet of paper, and we have to see that as an opportunity.
Andrew, any quick thoughts, 30 seconds?
Very quick. I think the U.S., UAE, and the U.S. GCC relationships are strong. They're based upon shared interests. One of those shared interests is combating terrorist groups in the region. The UAE in particular has been a very strong ally, as have the others. Why would that not continue under a Trump administration? That engagement would continue. The U.S. GCC defense security arrangements that deepened under the Obama administration, why would that not continue? That's a shared interest, and I think there should be reassurance on both sides that those relationships would deepen. And then third, especially when you come to the UAE and you see so many people-to-people, cultural contacts, business contacts as there are throughout the region, I think that also will continue as well. I see no reason in any of those three areas off the top of my head that the relationship should be challenged even with a Trump administration, given, of course, the degree of uncertainty and change that all that's happening. But those, to me, seem like constants at this time.
I guess I have to be the skunk on the panel. My worry is I agree so much with your assessment, where there's so much we don't know. And I guess my view is, and we learned more yesterday about one of the problems they have in transition is President-elect Trump not wanting to read briefing books. I mean, this is a person, when you begin to measure seriousness or not seriousness of the most important person in the land, my issue is, do what Jon said. Set up a frame and look for the best. But if it doesn't go that way, be prepared. Lower expectations, don't be dependent, because that would be a mistake in this climate. I would just share my personal views there. I think that when the United States is going to be tied in a knot, despite the consensus in the various branches of government, you're going to have protests in the street for a long time. And I think in that draws attention inward, and that will draw attention away from what is going on in the global system to some degree, not everywhere. But we've seen a man who is moved by flattery and says if Vladimir Putin is going to say nice things about me, I'm going to say nice things about him. That's not a serious approach to global affairs. And so my candid, because I don't want people to leave thinking we had a naive discussion up here that wasn't real about the prospects. And going back to Fred Kemp, everything is possible. That too is part of the possibility roster.
Steve, I think another dimension here that we've not talked about that is appropriate here are the checks and balances in our system. And typically you've got two robust parties are arguing their respective worldviews. And as a result of this election cycle, surprise, surprise, where the Republicans were devoid of content, and the thought was, how are they going to rebuild?
Yeah.
The Republicans have a new party. It's not the party of Lincoln and Roosevelt as much as it is Trump and populism, but the Democrats have been completely wiped out.
Right.
And it's almost like the 1980s all over again, where all my friends in the Democrat Party in that decade were, woe is us. Nobody likes us. Nobody will vote for us anymore. I think the Democrats have a lot of rebuilding to do, and the natural inclination will be to go to the left. Where Bernie Sanders resides, and to rebuild around that end of the party.
Great.
But our system doesn't function like it should, and we don't have the debates like we should without a robust two-party system, and right now we don't have it.
Excellent. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, but the alternative of a Hillary Clinton presidency with a Republican Senate and Republican House would have been a very, very contentious gridlock, I think.
Well, one has to think if you had had a Hillary Clinton presidency, you may still have had protests in the streets. You may still have had people, we had a lot of people basically saying they were going to grab their guns. I mean, you can have a very other kind of, one of the big questions, the hypotheticals that I would put out there was, is the Hillary Clinton we think we see out there really the Hillary Clinton we'll get? Because she too will have to deal with the Bernie Sanders movement and the Donald Trump strength and the economic issues that Jon Huntsman just talked about. So she may be, she would have been drawn in as well. Perhaps more robust out there, or trying to be, but there would have been constraints on Hillary, I agree.
Yeah, but the gridlock, I think, engendered by the continuing email problems and Clinton Foundation and everything, it would have just gone on and on. We would have been, I think we would have been paralyzed.
Where is Mustafa Al Ajmi? And I apologize, you get the last question, so make it good.
Okay, sir.
And make it clear.
Yes, absolutely. I want to move closer to the region. And Mr. Trump clearly stated his rejection of the Iranian nuclear deal, repeatedly, strongly. First,
just to clarify, he said he would renegotiate the Iran deal. He didn't say he would rip it up.
okay. What his alternative if the Iranians reject that? Is it the question of amendment for this agreement? This is what he's seeking. Is it a strict implementation of the agreement? The problem here, we cannot support in the region. We are not happy. We are not happy with the agreement. Absolutely, it's not an ideal agreement. But at the same time, we cannot support U.S. policy in meddling with this agreement when there is no clear alternative. We need to understand what is the alternative. Is it the alternative we're going to a war in the region? Eventually. If Mr. Trump put his condition and the Iranian reject that, that is mean practically you killing the agreement. Then what the alternative? So I wish that the panel will assess, tell us what the possibility here in this case. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to tell those people in the audience who have posed questions, we are going to get to you. We've been given more time since you apparently love this panel so much. So, John, I'm going to go to you because you were talking about amendments and repeals and the sort of the stance of going to. So Donald Trump on things like TPP and on the Iran deal and the notion of alternatives.
And I think it's going to go back to what he talked about in the campaign. So let's just say that with TPP, my guess is that the first 100 days, he's going to try to diminish that as much as he can, which means it disappears, which I think will be a heartbreak to a lot of people who see TPP as something larger than just a trade deal between 12 countries representing 40% of the world's GDP. It is, in fact, a reflection of our commitment to the Asia-Pacific region. It's a show of our legitimacy and our credibility. And that part, I don't think, has been factored into this broader discussion about trade is bad, let's correct it. So maybe when more of the information is in about this being as much a political tool and a commitment to the region long-term as it is an economic tool, maybe there will be some rethinking. But as of right now, I think TPP is dead. With Iran, my guess is that you have more of an amend kind of situation. Because I think the consequences of repeal and the nuclearization follow-on with all of the predictable countries and the proliferation concerns could be absolutely catastrophic. And I think that has to be worked out very carefully. With trade generally, it will be interesting to see how NAFTA is renegotiated. So as a former trade negotiator, you don't just renegotiate deals. Nobody will give the United States the time of day any longer at the negotiating table if they think in the years to come you're going to reopen up trade agreements and try to reopen them. So with NAFTA, what do? Maybe you can add to what has already been negotiated. Maybe trade adjustment assistance, which helps displaced workers and displaced communities, is enhanced a little bit. I could see something like that. Maybe there's greater language around intellectual property protection, which has been a major concern, particularly around Chinese IP theft. That could be added. But you just can't reopen up NAFTA and renegotiate the content. As with the Trans-Pacific, not Trans-Pacific, but TTIP with Europe, I just don't know where that sits. That's just so far back in the queue.
Jim and Andrew, just on this point real quickly, is Donald Trump setting up a game here where he talks about renegotiating the Iran deal or renegotiating NAFTA? I read his 100-day plan, and it's very carefully scripted, where words say, I will use every tool I have, or I will consult with my people on how to open up NAFTA. And if those tools don't open themselves up, he can blame other parts of the operation for being unable to create that space. So that his intent was there, but he's left wiggle room to blame lots of people for failure. And I'm interested in whether you see that the same way.
After you.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll respond directly to the Iran question, and here I really have little to add from what Governor Huntsman said and what I said initially, and that is that the Trump administration has said, and I believe is committed to some type of amend or revision, the idea of the sanctions, which are coming. I mean, this is not speculation. I mean, this is already in the Congress. We are going to move ahead with sanctions on Iran to put the pressure on Iran. The intent, I think, as I understand how Trump and the people around him would see it, is that this pressure would somehow create an incentive for Iran to renegotiate. It would put so much pressure on them, or if there was a renegotiation, let me put it that way, that Iran would be more inclined to negotiate a deal more favorable to the United States. If that's the case, then I agree with you, Steve, that that's a dashed expectation because the Iran deal is an international deal. There's no sign in the EU, Russia, China, or anywhere else of an interest in a negotiation, I'll say it again, in the absence of a breach by Iran. Other than that, that's going to go forward, and what might happen, I'm not saying it would happen, but what might happen is if the Trump administration made this a priority with our allies in Europe or trying to negotiate, there would be friction and trade-offs elsewhere. How do you get the EU, Russia, China, India, other countries to walk back from it? It's just simply not going to happen unless the Iranians break the deal.
Thank you. Let me take a question from Khaled Dakil.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen.
And where are you?
Hey.
Oh, great. Hi.
Hi.
Please.
Yeah, my question is about the war on ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Don't you think that there is an obsession in the United States on this terrible organization at the expense of the true problem of terrorism? You know, in the 90s, the war on terrorism started with Al-Qaeda, and the Americans became obsessed with Al-Qaeda. And after 25 years, more than 25 years, Al-Qaeda is still with us. And instead of having just one terrorist organization, what we have now is more than at least tens, if not hundreds, of terrorist organizations roaming the region, from North Africa to the far end of the Arab East. So the question here, and ISIS is going to be defeated and destroyed.
Right.
But the question is, where do we go from there? What is the concept of this war on terrorism?
So, Jim, let me ask you to take that question. Are we overly focused, distracted, overly consumed with ISIS and terrorism at a cost to other issues?
Yeah, well, I think that the answer is that there's no short-term answer. There's no short-term solution. There's no military solution to this. And I alluded earlier in my remarks that I do believe that the ultimate defeat of terrorism has more to do with the developed world, if you will, the Europeans, Gulf states, US, and others, working together to create a fabric in those countries where terrorism is finding root, to change the paradigm of hope for the future by the application of certainly security measures, but coupled with what I would call more proactive engagement to help societies transform themselves. If you don't have access to energy, if you don't have access to water, if you don't have access to food, we have it within our collective means to change that paradigm. Yeah. You're not going to guess right 100% of the time, but to the gentleman's question about North Africa, it's absolutely correct, or sub-Saharan Africa. There are public and private sector engagement strategies that involve security, economic development, governance, and rule of law that can be applied holistically to, I think, ultimately be the guarantor of the defeat of these radical movements. But it's not going to be kinetic. It has to be something, it has to be more than that. That's a personal opinion.
Thank you. Next question. We have Saad Al Ajmi. There you are. Greetings.
Thank you, sir. Last year I was sitting next to General James Jones, and he knew I was a military man. He asked me, where do you serve? I said, Desert Storm. He said, where? I said, 2nd Marine Division. He said, I was there. I was the commander of that unit. So after 20 years, he gave me the Marines Medal.
Ooh.
During that time, I think liberating Kuwait was a genuine American value. Now America is creating new values like counter-terrorism, and today he added a new thing, and stopping illegal immigrations. My question is, Trump mentioned Americanism instead of globalism. He mentioned no free military umbrella for allies, a new military doctrine. Do you see Trump as the new Mikhail Gorbachev with the perestroika, as at least in military? Do you see the decline of the U.S., at least in military, or its role in the world?
I have to say, I didn't expect this question. It's a very interesting one. Do you see Donald Trump as the Gorbachev and perestroika leading to the downfall of the United States? John?
No.
No.
We're going through a moment not dissimilar to other moments we've seen in American history, where our economy is not healthy, where there are concerns among the American people about our overextension abroad. And it's a correction moment, where so long as we're based on the principles of our Constitution, a commitment to rule of law, and a sense of equality, one for all, which is something that has to be worked on constantly in the United States, I think this is a corrective moment. And I wouldn't put it as sweeping as a Gorbachev in the Soviet Union by any sense, because we still have those checks and balances where Gorbachev had no checks and balances. He was in dire straits economically, overburdened on the defense side with fewer and fewer friends in the world. I think we still maintain a robust network of friends and allies, and I suspect that Trump, when he speaks more, and this is only my hunch, will talk more about the importance of those relationships with friends and allies. We haven't heard the fullness of that language, but I'm guessing we'll hear more of it. So let's let a little more time pass before we
General,
make judgments.
quick reaction.
Yeah, I don't see him as a Gorbachev, and I think we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But I agree with Governor Huntsman. I think this is a defining moment in our history, and we'll just have to wait and see a little bit. But I don't think it's my interpretation of his campaign rhetoric was he wants to retool the American model, if you will. I heard him say that he wants to enhance the Defense Department, enhance the military. And if that's the case, then what are you going to do with it? So if you're going to use it to be proactively engaged to prevent future conflicts, which is what I would think would be a good idea, in cooperation with our friends and allies around the world and rebuild those relationships and trust, then I think we have a good shot. But I think it's too early to tell yet.
I agree. Next question. Ali Kaderi, and we'll direct this to Andrew. Ali Kaderi? Yes.
Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Ali Kaderi, a former American diplomat and a political advisor to 3 CENTCOM commanders. My question is for General Jones. Sir, we were talking earlier about radical militant political Islam. So turning to the other side of the coin, rather than ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Shia political Islam, in the form of the IRGC, the Quds Force, and their proxies. On January 12th of this year, Muhammad Ali Ja'fari, the commander of the IRGC, said that they had cultivated 200,000 proxies across Lebanon, the Levant, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Yemen. And then more recently, throughout the anti-ISIS campaign in Iraq, we've seen Quds Force proxies flying sectarian flags and their militias' flags atop American-provided M1A1s, Humvees, MRAPs, Paladins, howitzers, and other American kit.
Near the end.
So the question I have is, how, if you were advising the president-elect, would you advise him to confront and contain these jihadist groups and their state sponsor of terrorism, Iran?
Well, I think it's not only a U.S. problem. I think it has to be done with a strong alliance of regional actors, and that includes military force, but it also includes a grander vision of how you change the economies and how you change the expectations of the population. So I think that the United States has to have a clear voice, a clear strategy, and it has to be articulated and developed, and it has to have the operational implementation tools, but it has to be done in concert with the nations that are most affected by this. On the Iran question, because this all gets back to, it seems to me, to Iran, you know, the question is how do you modify Iran's behavior? Quite apart from the nuclear deal. I mean, I happen to think that, and I agree with Andrew's characterization on how the deal was done in the U.S., but it is an international agreement, and there are other sovereign countries that are not, at least for now, going to walk that deal back. But the question still remains, and I think to your question, is how do you change behavior? And we have to come to grips with that. And I believe that sanctions is what brought Iran to the table on the nuclear deal. And I think that renewed application, regional sanctions, U.S. involvement might ultimately change behavior. But I think you have to do more than what we've done, because otherwise Iran's going to continue on its path.
Let me take another question, but I feel with Ali's good question, I've got to just, the one element I would add, as I've written a lot about sanctions, is that we talk about them in a way in which they sound so easy to achieve in this world today, in which, you know, and I think it's one of the flaws of the America First notion, is that actually you can't accomplish anything if India and Brazil and China and parts of Europe aren't in the game. And there is this presumption in U.S. discourse on sanctions that everyone will fall into line.
Right.
And I think the notion of nations falling into line is probably suspect in the coming Trump years. So we'll see how that is, but it's a great question. Mahmoud Mahmedo, I think that's my friend. Is he here? Yes. Oh, hey. Hi.
Hi, Steve.
Good friend.
All right. Hello, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your presentations.
And do it loudly and closer to the mic.
Closer to the mic.
And quickly.
Very quickly. Quick comment and a quick question. On the election, I think that there are the checks and balances you mentioned, and the country does have alliances in Europe and in this region, which will allow a navigating of the storm. I think, however, the U.S. is going into uncharted territory with this election, and I think this will reveal itself once the honeymoon is finished, and we'll go into the more consequential decisions that this presidency will take. My question is going to be on ISIS and AQ, which was already touched upon a bit. So it's rather straightforward. The Bush administration could not deal with Al-Qaeda, and the Obama administration could not really deal with ISIS. Mr. Trump has privileged a military response, the bombing wording he's been using about ISIS. Once that is actually put in motion, and even if ISIS is defeated, it will be eventually, how will he handle the more consequential and lasting transnational threat that the United States has been, and the world, has been dealing with for the past 30 years, if the only approach that he has put forth is the military one?
Good question. Thoughts, reactions, Andrew?
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
Please. Well, I think we're already engaged heavily militarily against ISIS. It's losing territory. The battle for Mosul is not going easily. We see the reports of atrocities committed by ISIS as they leave. There's talk of the encirclement and eventual attack on Raqqa. So I think, again, in the realm of continuity, what you're going to see is perhaps some amendment or adjustment or intensification of a campaign that's already underway. In terms of the long-term aspect of it, I mean, that's a good question, because that's what matters after the military defeat. There are, of course, many UN Security Council resolutions on financing and how to deal with these groups. Those need to be enforced and enacted. As General Jones laid out, I won't repeat it. It is deeply dependent on how we deal with our allies here. There is no other way we're going to deal with the long-term consequences of that. You cannot fully defeat terrorist groups, but you can marginalize them and push them to the edge so that the damage they do is increasingly less and infrequent, and I think that's the path we want to go on. And we have to keep in mind very specifically the political issues around it, very specifically. What do we do in the post-conflict situations in Syria and Iraq to be sure that those countries do not become chronically failing or failed states, and then you will have these problems continue again and again and again. I would add Yemen to that list as well.
Steve, I'd just like to underscore what Andrew just said. If you don't have a plan beyond the kinetic phase, then you will fail. I mean, we've seen this over and over now. You have to have a more comprehensive plan. You have to, and I've said it 2 or 3 times, I mean, you have to give people hope that there's a better future once the shooting stops. And if we're not willing to do that collectively, and we can do that collectively, I believe that, we have the capacity to do that, then we will just have another Libya or another Iraq or another Afghanistan.
Or an Egypt collapsing, which we haven't discussed. John?
So Steve, the issue of governance generally becomes a very important one, and I don't think we talk about it nearly enough. What are the principles of governance? What are the safeguards of governance? What are your constitutional bottom lines? What is your commitment to rule of law? I think one of the biggest problems we face really is governments that lack legitimacy, that don't represent the will and aspirations of the people. They fail, ultimately. Corruption is an issue that we don't talk about enough, yet it is rife in almost every corner of the country. So how can you have a governing entity that has full legitimacy without addressing the underlying cancerous elements that make it less than legitimate, which then give rise to ungoverned territories, which then give rise to a lot of bad behavior? These are fundamental issues that, beyond just the security and the kinetic side, as the general said, you've got to have a plan for this.
I would also say, and we'll just take the one last question, that there's a big concern around these questions, and I don't think there's a real clear strategy on what to do. But I can tell you that one of the concerns by very well-meaning public servants, people like John Kerry, Chuck Hagel before him, and others, when they see countries like Egypt right now struggling to hold it together, and Kerry was very involved with the $12 billion IMF loan, but Egypt is so short, Sisi is so underperforming, but it's basically a powder keg when you look at, and you ask that question, and the U.S. wanders in, and we've done about $700 million of various kinds of loan guarantees, whereas the UAE and Saudi Arabia put in a lot more, but we're just not a player in the world right now when it comes to putting dollars on the table to influence the needles in these countries. Regardless of governance, we just don't put money on the table to help animate alternative ways of dealing with that. That means we're not really helping on the jobs front, not helping much on the economic front, not doing trade deals which we're not going to do trade deals, right? So it's an interesting challenge. The last question we have, we're going to make it really short. Hamdan Al-Shahri.
Yes, here.
Yes, great. And this
Okay.
is, we're going to make it short responses.
Okay. Well, we tried for 8 years to understand Mr. Obama administration in countering terrorism. Well, at the end, we couldn't understand him. Now we are trying to do the same with Mr. Trump and his administration. Is he going to counter terrorism, I mean, in all the militia, I mean, the Shiite and Sunni, or is going to be the same that in the past, I mean, without countering terrorism? Why? Because something very important, if we see that countering terrorism, even all the militias, that means we are countering terrorism, really. And also we are countering also the Iranian. That means we are going to understand how it's going to be the policy for the new administration if they are serious in facing the Iranian and the terrorism. Thank you.
Quick reactions, Andrew?
Well, I think the incoming Trump administration, like the outgoing Obama administration, is giving counterterrorism a top priority, and ISIS is at the top of the list. It's also at the top of the list of what most Americans are concerned about. As we discussed earlier, I think there is a concern in the United States about Iranian behavior in the region. I think that will continue under a Trump administration and intensify. But it will depend, and ultimately, on our relationship and engagement here and how we work out these deep-seated regional conflicts, including in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So the short answer is the issues of ISIS and Iran, I think, will continue to be a concern in this administration.
I agree with that.
Jim, Jon Huntsman?
We've got 4 civil wars in the region. They've got to be dealt with realistically from a security standpoint, but then what after the security is stabilized? I'll just end on this thought, because the UAE has an important role to play in all of this. And it might not always appear this way, but the UAE is a respected voice everywhere, but certainly in the United States. And your opinions matter. And if ever there was a time to connect with a new administration, to make your voice heard, and to make sure that your priorities really do reflect the priorities of the region, which I know they do, then I think you need to really engage in ways that maybe you never have before, because I think our interests are allied in a lot of these very important areas. And I commend you for your great progress, and I just hope that we all can better come together around some of these regional priorities.
And with that, we're going to end it. Big thanks to Jon Huntsman, General Jim Jones, and Andrew Parasiliti. Thank you for taking us through Trumpquake. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.